Abbas Mirza. I am a member of Students Taking Action Now and the Muslim Student Association, two groups which are co-sponsoring the event tonight, along with CAPA. Tonight we have Norman Finkelstein, who is a political scientist, scholar, author, a lecturer, whose main focus includes the politics of the Holocaust and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. He's the author of 5 books that have been translated into more than 40 languages, including his best-selling work, The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. His writings have been commended for his meticulously researched, brilliantly illuminating, and superb scholarship by many leading scholars in related studies. Avi Shalem, an Israeli professor of international relations at Oxford University, reviewing Norman Finkelstein's latest book, Beyond Chutzpah, praises the author for his erudition, originality, spark, meticulous attention to detail, intellectual integrity, courage, and formidable forensic skills. Furthermore, aside from his scholarship, what distinguishes Dr. Finkelstein from all the other scholars is the scathing moral outrage ever present as the backdrop to his arguments. This has led his critics, of which there are many, to condemn his writing as polemical, but he maintains that it is possible to unite exacting scholarly rigor with his moral outrage. Regardless of his superb scholarship, Norman Finkelstein has had to pay a heavy price for his views. In June of 2007, he was denied tenure at DePaul University, despite being ranked as one of the top professors in student evaluations and being recognized as a prolific scholar and an outstanding teacher by the university. There was also an attempt to censor publication of his book, Beyond Chutzpah, and many letters were sent to the University of California Press for this effect, ironically by a self-declared civil libertarian by the name of Alan Dershowitz. In May of last year, he was accorded with the peculiar distinction of being a person of Jewish background and yet barred entry from the State of Israel. Despite many setbacks in his professional and personal life, Norman Finkelstein's views have been unwavering, and he has remained relentless in his criticism of the policies of the State of Israel. The topic he will be lecturing on tonight, Israel's latest assault on Gaza, is of utmost importance and urgency, not merely because of its human cost, but also because the United States was and remains to be a party to the conflict. The general lack of awareness and understanding of the conflict only serves to exacerbate this problem. Thus, in order to bring forth many of these inconvenient facts and to try and spur further discussion on campus and within the greater Lowell community, I would like for you to help me welcome our speaker tonight, Norman Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me here. My first time in Lowell, and I wish I had more time to see the place. I know it has a lot of history behind it, and I was searching my memory trying to recall what happened in Lowell. When I get home, I'm going to check my history books and try to remember all the important events that happened here. Now, what I want to do at the beginning is to try to sketch out how we got to where we are today. You're under no obligation as undergraduates to all of a sudden know the whole history of the conflict. So just by a show of hands, if I were to ask you, how many of you are familiar with the June 1967 war? Just raise your hands so I'll know. Oh, quite a lot. How many are not? No, be honest, and I could just fill in fairly quickly with the background. Raise your hand. So we'd say at least about a third. Okay, so just bear with me as I just begin with some background information which will enable most of you, if not all of you, to follow what I have to say in my prepared remarks. The conflict usually, the beginnings of the conflict are usually dated from around the end of the 19th century, when this movement emerges in Europe and it's called Zionism. And basically, Zionism is a movement that's trying to answer some problems that Jews are facing in Europe at the time. The Zionist movement begins at the end of the 19th century, and it basically wants to address two kinds of problems, which many Americans, yourselves, will understand because there were similar kinds of problems in the United States when it came not to Jews, but to African Americans. And the two kinds of problems were these. Number one, Jews were the object of a lot of discrimination that often climaxed in violence against Jews, what was called back then pogroms. And pogroms basically meant organized riots. And many Jews came to the conclusion that Europe would never accept Jews as being equals with the rest of the peoples there, and that the only solution was for Jews to form their own state, to just pack up and leave. And in the American context, there was a similar movement. Some of you will know from African American history, it was the movement led by a fellow named Marcus Garvey. How many people have heard of Marcus Garvey? Okay, well, Marcus Garvey back then, he was called a black Zionist. Namely, he said blacks will never be fully accepted in the United States, and therefore the only answer is for them to return to their homeland and try to establish a state there. And he was an African-American version of what Jewish Zionists were in Europe. That was one problem. The other problem was kind of the reversed side of the coin. Namely, some Jews felt that if Jews were ever fully accepted in Europe, if they ever gained full acceptance, it would result in the Jewish people as Jews disappearing, because Jews would assimilate into European culture, and they would become so accepted that at some point most Jews will figure, well, what the heck, we might as well just become Christians and forget about our past. And so the Zionists were trying to solve two problems at once. First, the problem of discrimination, and then just the opposite, the problem of assimilation. Discrimination and assimilation. In some places, they were being discriminated against. In other places, they were assimilating and they were disappearing as a people. And the Zionist movement, as I said, reached the conclusion, well, let's just establish a state of our own. And if we establish a state of our own, we can both overcome the problem of discrimination, and we'll create a Jewish community, one which is distinct from all other non-Jewish communities. Once they decided to create a state, the obvious question became, well, where are we going to create this state? As I said a few moments ago, Marcus Garvey, when he had to figure where would African Americans create the state, he said, obviously, we'll go back to where we originated. We'll go back to Africa. And the Zionists said basically the same thing. We should create a state where the Jewish people originated. And the Jewish people originated in this place called Palestine, or Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. So far, no major problems arise. And were it the case that Palestine were empty, were it simply an isolated or unpopulated South Sea island, probably no major problems would have arisen. Those who wanted to create their own state would just pack up their bags and go, and get on with the business of trying to create a state or create a country. But for the Zionist movement, they decided, as I said, in this place called Palestine. But Palestine was not empty. There was an indigenous population that lived there. Somewhere along the, you could say roughly about 500,000 people lived there, overwhelmingly Muslim and Christian Arab. There was a tiny Jewish population, about 5 or 10% of the population of Palestine, but it was overwhelmingly not Jewish. And so now the Zionist movement has a problem. How do you create a Jewish state in an area which is overwhelmingly not Jewish? That's the challenge. How do you create a Jewish state in an area which is overwhelmingly not Jewish? And basically, there are only two possible ways to do it. One was to do pretty much what happened in South Africa. You create a state which gives most, if not all of the rights to Jews, and gives less, and maybe even none of the rights to the indigenous population. That is to create a kind of apartheid state, where one group of people have all the rights, and another group of people have pretty much none of the rights. Another possibility is to sort of do what we did in the United States, because basically the so-called founding fathers, they wanted to create a white republic. And they had the same problem as the Zionists had, but of course much earlier. Namely, the area was not empty. It wasn't uninhabited. There were people that lived here. And basically what the United States did was a combination of expelling the indigenous population and exterminating the indigenous population. Some version of those two. By the time the Zionist movement comes along at the end of the 19th century, it was no longer considered legitimate to exterminate indigenous populations. That's just not allowed anymore by the standards of international morality. But the idea of kicking the indigenous population out, that was not considered completely unacceptable. And so the Zionist movement comes along, and it has some vague ideas that at some point, if the indigenous population rejects what we're doing, at some point that maybe they're going to have to be, the word that was used back then was transferred out, and maybe they'll go to Egypt, maybe to Jordan, maybe to Syria, maybe to Lebanon. It was considered no big deal because they were all Arabs anyway, and they were all, or mostly Muslims. So if they have to move a few thousand feet or a couple of hundred miles, it wasn't seen as being any great injustice, at least not by the Zionist movement. Well, as you can imagine, the indigenous population of Palestine didn't take kindly to the idea of trying to create a Jewish state in their homeland. And so pretty early in the Zionist movement, you could say by the 1920s, already protests developed. Some of the protests turned quite violent as the indigenous population resists this enterprise, this idea which in their minds is going to end up either marginalizing them or transferring them out of their own homeland. By the mid-1930s, serious problems occurred. Most of you know some of the history of the 20th century. So by the mid-1930s, two developments become important. Number one, as most of you know, in the mid-1930s, Hitler begins his rise to power, or in the mid-1930s.